In the last lecture, we saw the few terms of hacking. Now in this lecture, we will see what is a pen testing, vulnerability assessment, and VAPT. So let us get started. What is a penetration test? A penetration test is a subclass of ethical hacking. It comprises of a set of methods and procedures that aim at testing and protecting an organization's security. The penetration tests prove helpful in finding vulnerabilities in an organization and check whether an attacker will be able to exploit them to gain unauthorized access to an asset. Penetration testing is a method of evaluating the security of an information system or network by simulating an attack to find out vulnerabilities that an attacker could exploit. It exposes the gaps in the security model of an organization and helps organizations reach a balance between technical powers and business functionality from the perspective of potential security breaches. This can help in disaster recovery and business continuity planning. It stimulates methods used by intruders to gain unauthorized access to an organization's network systems and then compromises them and involves using proprietary and open source tools to conduct the test. Apart from automated techniques, penetration testing involves manual techniques for conducting targeted testing on specific systems to ensure that there are no security flaws that previously might have gone undetected. So, why are these tests important? With cyber attacks becoming the norm, it is more important than ever before to undertake regular vulnerability scanning and penetration testing to identify vulnerabilities and ensure on a regular basis that the cyber controls are working. Penetration testing looks at vulnerabilities and will try and to exploit them. The testing is often stopped when the objective is achieved, that is, when an access to a network has been gained. This means there can be other exploitable vulnerabilities not tested. Organizations need to conduct regular testing of their systems for the following key reasons: to determine the weakness in the infrastructure or applications and people in order to develop controls. To ensure controls have been implemented and are effective, this will provide an assurance to information security and senior management. Then, to test applications that are often the avenues of attack, that is, people who can make mistakes despite best practices in software development. And lastly, to evaluate system efficiency and to discover new bugs in existing softwares so that they can be patched and adopted suitable compliance. The worst situation is to have an exploitable vulnerability within company, application or people that you are not aware of, as the attackers will be probing your assets even you are not. Breaches, unless publicized by the attackers, can go undetected for months, and that is why carrying out frequent penetration tests are important for an organization. Now the next question is, what is vulnerability assessment, that is VA? You might have a question that in the last couple of minutes we saw that penetration testing also involves finding out vulnerabilities, but vulnerability assessment is different. Here the main goal is to figure out the vulnerabilities only. We do not exploit vulnerabilities in a vulnerability assessment test. VA is a process to run and identify, detect and classify the security loopholes in applications, websites, computers, networks, information technology systems, and communication systems. I have used the word identify, detect, and classify, and therefore this is the major difference between a vulnerability assessment and a penetration testing. A minor loophole in a network can put your entire system at risk and let all your information out. The loopholes allow third parties to access and explicitly steal and exploit the database and information of your entire network system. Vulnerability management is the process of prioritizing, identifying, classifying, and then mitigating software vulnerabilities. Penetration testing, however, is an active process and requires ethical hackers with profound knowledge of networking and hacking. Now you may get confused. Is there any difference between VA and PT? Because the two terminologies are often used as VAPT. But yes, there is a difference. Oftentimes, a vulnerability assessment is confused with a penetration tester. However, those terms have completely different meanings. In a vulnerability assessment, our goal is to figure out all the vulnerabilities in an assess and then document them accordingly. In a penetration test, however, we need to simulate as an attacker to see if we are actually able to exploit that vulnerability and then document the findings that were exploited and the ones that turned out to be false positives. Another difference is a vulnerability assessment is aimed at identifying known vulnerabilities in an organization's infrastructure, whereas a penetration test, on the other hand, evaluates the security of an asset by running a series of planned attacks with the goal of finding and exploiting vulnerabilities. Vulnerability assessment does not actually exploit the vulnerabilities, but it identifies and considers the overall security management processes. But in a penetration test, these vulnerabilities are exploited to see the results. In other words, the vulnerability assessment is a part of the penetration testing process, but the actual exploitation in the next phase of the penetration testing cycle. Penetration testing is more complete process and goes as follows, like information gathering, footprinting, vulnerability assessment, exploitation, and then reporting. So you can find that VA is actually a subset of penetration testing. And then we will see the different rules of engagement. Every penetration test you do would comprise of rules of engagement, which basically defines how a penetration test would be laid out, what methodology would be used, and start and end dates, the milestones, the goals of the penetration test, the liabilities and responsibilities. All of them have to be mutually agreed upon by both the customer and the representative before the penetration test is started. So after this course, you can do a proper penetration test, and before doing that, you must apply these rules of engagement. So make sure you listen to these points very carefully. The first one is agreements. A proper permission to hack, that is authorization, and a non-disclosure agreement should be signed by both the parties. Now you cannot directly go and hack a random website before taking prior permission. In ethical hacking, it is a common practice to take the permission first before testing any organization or a website. Scope. The scope of the engagement and what part of the organizations must be tested. Then the project duration, including both the start and the end date. The methodology to be used for conducting a penetration test, then the goals of a penetration test, then the allowed and disallowed techniques, whether denial of service testing should be performed or not, whether SQL injection should be performed or not, and much more. And finally, the liabilities and responsibilities, which are decided ahead of time. As a penetration tester, you might break into something that should not be accessible, causing a denial of service. And then you might access sensitive information such as credit cards. Therefore, liabilities should be defined prior to the engagement. So make sure you follow all these points before starting a penetration test. In the next lecture, we will see the different types of pen testing methodologies that are used to carry out penetration tests in today's world.